This territory was subject of the Dish One Spoon, One Palm Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peacefully care and share for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Acknowledging the traditional land on which we live and work is a small but important step that reminds us to learn more about the Indigenous peoples in these regions, to consider the history and ongoing colonialism on this land, and to reflect on how each and every one of us can contribute to reconciliation. You can visit a native land in New Scotland to learn more about the land that you're on and who it belongs to. So, today is our Earth Hour event. Earth Hour is held on the last Saturday of March every year, and the hour is from 8:30 to 9:30, where they encourage everybody to keep their lights off in order to do just a small part to help our Earth and to encourage you to learn about the different things that we can do to try to save it. You can learn more about Earth Hour at the earthhour.org website. So, if this is your first time attending AstroTours, we generally run our tours on the first Thursday of the month, but we decided to do this one on Earth Hour, so it's on a Saturday. And also note that we will not have an April tour because that would be like a week from now, and our next one will be in May. So for tonight, we're going to begin with talks from our speakers, Professor Hoffmann, Devin Gray, and Amanda Harvey-Sanchez, and then we're going to have a panel by them. After that, we're going to head over to the Planet Physical Laboratory in order to look at the telescopes, because it is starting to figure out excitingly, or at least to learn about the telescopes. We also do a bunch of different activities, such as our bending space-time and gravitational lensing one, and there will also be lab tours. We will be having 2 lab tours, one of the SHARP, or Spectroscopic and High Angular Resolution and Photonics Imaging Lab, that works on the next generation of optical and infrared astronomical instruments, specifically one called earmuffs. And they're doing something known as adaptive optics. And if you want to learn what that is, you can go to the lab tours. The astronauts have tickets, they're free tickets, it's just to get a time slot for when you visit the labs. And the second one is our long wavelength lab. They work on telescopes such as the Southpole Telescope and CHIME, or the Canadian Hydrogen Intensity Mapping Experiment, which is actually located in BC. So it's a flagship radio telescope that was run and led by Canadian astronomers. Great. So before we get into the event for tonight, I'm first just going to tell you a little bit about some upcoming events. So our next AstroTours, as I said, will be in May. It's May 4th at 8 p.m. The location is to be determined still, but you can check our social media and website for that information. And the talk will be given by a postdoc, actually the same researcher as me, Dr. Neil One, on mapping our universe in the millimeter. For some other groups, as always, you can check the website for RAS, or the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada, to look at a variety of online and in-person events happening in this area. And also, you can look at the Belknap Institute Facebook page for information about their Cosmos from Your Couch video series, as well as their virtual Astro Trivia Night, coming up on April 11th at 7 p.m. So I'd now like to move on to the event for tonight. So tonight, our first speaker is Professor Matthew Hoffmann. He is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto Scarborough and co-directs the Environmental Governance Lab. He teaches classes on environmental and sustainability politics and global governance. His research on climate change and environmental politics has been published in 4 books and over 50 journal articles and book chapters. He also regularly contributes to media outlets such as the Toronto Star, the Globe and Mail, and The Conversation. Professor Hoffmann was co-editor of the Journal of Global Environmental Politics from 2017 to 2022, and currently serves as the chair of the board of directors for the environmental NGO Green Economy Canada. I'd now like to pass it off to Professor Hoffmann to tell us about why climate change action gets stuck and what to do about it.
Great, thank you. It's really lovely to be here for this event, and I appreciate you having me in. So I'm going to begin with something pretty banal. This is just a gas station a couple blocks away from here in my neighborhood on Harvard Street. And this gas station went up and was constructed in 2021. And I'm going to start here because in a time sort of spectacularly marked by climate impacts, think forest fires, think floods, think droughts, think the specter of millions of climate refugees. The opening of a new gas station in Toronto didn't raise an eyebrow. Certainly not a protest. It was literally unremarkable, ordinary. Now, it's a small gas station in my neighborhood, big deal. Among all the other horrors of climate change and all of the crimes against climate action, think very recent crimes against climate action. President Biden opening up new oil fields in Alaska, or the Coastal GasLink pipeline being forced through wet sweatland in BC. I started talking on climate change with a really stupid little gas station in my neighborhood. Well, I started here because this gas station is actually a microcosm of the obstacles and challenges that we face for pursuing progressive and aggressive climate action. It's why we get stuck. It's a microcosm of why we get stuck. And also thinking about the ordinariness of this gas station helps me to think about the levers that we might have to pull to change, to get unstuck. And let me be clear, we don't suffer from a lack of climate action in this world. We have a global treaty in place right now. We have national climate policy in Canada, TO here in Toronto. We have the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States. We have growth in renewable energy. Corporate net zero goals are proliferating every day. People are buying heat pumps and electric vehicles. But we don't have the kind of progress that we might want to see, even though there's all this sort of flurry of activity. In fact, this is one of my favorite we don't have progress graphs. This graph actually makes it look like international negotiations are causing climate change. So the treaties themselves are not fixing climate change, but they seem to be correlated with rising temperatures. Now, this is probably the hardest problem that humanity's ever faced, because it requires massive transformation of basically everything we do. Our energy systems, our transportation systems, our agricultural systems, our economies. And not only does it require transformation of all of these, it has to be done quickly, and it has to be done consciously. This isn't going to just happen by chance. So it's actually not that much of a surprise that we haven't seen the kind of progress we might want to have seen, and why we're not making the progress that we need, even though there's all kinds of stuff happening. Two reasons really stand out to me for why, and sort of capture the big umbrella reasons for why we get stuck. And I think it's really important to understand these reasons why we get stuck if we want to think about getting unstuck and moving forward in climate change. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about inertia, and the inertia in the system, behind the status quo, and entrenched interests that support that status quo as two interconnected reasons why we get stuck. All right, let's talk about inertia. We all face non-thinking or unthinking non-choices every day, right? Every day. This is a great, to me, example of a unthinking choice, being stuck in a traffic jam on Spadina. But I don't just mean individuals face unthinking non-choices every day. The non-choices of governments, bureaucracies, bylaws, and communities continually reinforce the status quo. In fact, the deck is actually stacked pretty strongly against climate action, because what is seen as possible is constrained by what is. The status quo is powerful, and the status quo is infused with the use of fossil energy. Climate impacts are baked in to almost everything we do. Our cities are designed to move people by car and to automatically connect houses to a natural gas grid. Growing, transporting, and shopping for food is fueled by oil and gas. Your bank accounts are almost certainly linked to the fossil fuel sector through banking decisions. Sociologist Gregory Unruh dubbed this carbon locking, the idea that much of our society, economy, and lives are built around the extraction and use of fossil energy. And it's usually literally unremarkable, not remarked upon. And these overlapping forces, overlapping social, technological, sociological, economic forces that make the use of fossil energy in almost everything that we do natural and unremarked. As the author David Foster Wallace said, fish don't know they're in water. And we've only begun as a society to consciously recognize that we're in a fossil energy dominated world. Now, the implication of this inertia behind the ubiquity of the fossil energy world is that attempts to change often get washed over and pushed back by the inertia of the system. Now, sometimes this is entirely obvious and visible, right? And so in the mid-2010s, the province of Ontario put in place a number of electric vehicle charging stations in Metrolinx parking lots as part of a broader shift in what was then the McGuinty and then Wynne governments towards some climate policy. 2018, those were removed, as were most of the climate policies. And so one way that we can see inertia in the system is through very obvious political backlash against some action towards climate change, in this case at the provincial level. But there's also more insidious and less visible ways that the inertia in the system that supports the status quo keeps getting us stuck even though we start to make progress. And so you'll often hear things like, replace your light bulbs, save energy, and you'll save money. Right? This notion that as individuals take action to alter what's going on in their lives, that it's good for the environment, because it saves energy, and it's good for the pocketbook, because you will have your energy bills will be lower. This logic is almost unassailable, except for the inertia built up in a system that we don't see and we don't think about. Because let's say you save $100 on your energy bills over the course of the year by putting in LED lights or doing other kinds of things for energy efficiency in your home or apartment. You're a good environmentalist, so you don't take that $100 and buy another appliance that will just suck up that energy that you just saved. You put it in the bank, right? You put it in the bank. One of our 5 big banks, right? Well, here's where the inertia in the system will get you. Your $100 that you gave to RBC just became, because of leverage lending, a $1,000 investment in the tar sands. And so your action to save some energy turns into a relatively large investment into the tar sands. And this is precisely because inertia in the system tends to wash out the kind of actions that we're talking about, because we're talking about very large systems that have quite a bit of momentum behind them. Okay? But this inertia isn't just mindless or passive. And I think it's important to remember this. It's also wrapped up with and supported by entrenched interests that actively work to support the status quo and to slow climate action. Now, this happens in a lot of ways, but a prominent one is by shifting the discussion and the blame for climate change to individuals and our choices. I'm sure you've all heard something along these lines. You're to blame for climate change. We all are. You drive to work. You fly for vacation. You heat or cool your home to a comfy 22 degrees. These kind of arguments are ubiquitous. It's not the oil companies or the government that should be taking action. We are the ones that use oil and fossil energy. Right? The problem with these kind of arguments is not that they're not true, it's that they only tell half the story. The other problem with these kind of arguments and these kind of statements is they don't come from nowhere. These arguments are ubiquitous for a reason. Two scholars, Jeffrey Supran and Naomi Oreskes from Harvard University, figured out one of the reasons why. They arise at least in part from very conscious communication strategies coming out of the fossil fuel industry that blames climate change on demand for fossil fuels rather than on larger structural factors and larger industry decisions. Of course, this means that industry or governmental action are less legitimate and necessary. You, driver, vacation taker, home heater, you're the real cause of the problem. We, the fossil fuel industry, are just catering to your needs. It's on you. It's no real mystery or surprise that the whole notion of individual carbon footprint was actually first developed by the company British Petroleum. So the slog that we have to go through to pursue climate action is a matter of wading through the inertia of everyday non-choices. But to really abuse the metaphor, the terrain that we're wading through was muddied on purpose by entrenched interests that want to see the status quo continue. Part of this is in part because of the fruit of a successful fossil fuel industry strategy that seeks to blunt large-scale collective responses to climate change and focus attention on individual choices. As Jeffrey Supran said when he was talking to CNN about this article, we are all passively guilty, born into a fossil fuel society. But fossil fuel companies are actively guilty for working to keep society the way it is. And just to bring it back to my neighborhood Esso station that went up in 2022, the title of Supran and Oreskes' articles was Rhetoric and Frame Analysis of ExxonMobil's Climate Change and Communications. ExxonMobil is Esso in the United States. So we're right back to that shiny new Esso station in my neighborhood. So, given inertia, given entrenched interests, is it all just too late? Should we all just go to the beach and give up and just enjoy our last days? I don't think so. There's actually ways of getting unstuck. Even the latest UN report that just came out this week, which had many dire warnings, also laid out roadmaps for action that could help us avoid the worst of the climate catastrophes that could be on the horizon if we fail to act. But we do have to act. We have to get unstuck and translate all that urgency and all that action that I talked about earlier around climate change into actual transformation that breaks through the inertia and the entrenched interests that we face. And I think about this in terms of three kinds of leverage points or levers that we can pull. First, we have to be thinking about system change, not individual or not single actions, right? So it's about changing light bulbs and changing the banking system and pushing for financial change, whether that's through the divestment movement for institutional investments or even talking to your advisor when you're setting up an RRSP about fossil-free mutual funds at your bank. It's also at the national level about ecosystems of policies rather than single-shot choices. There are no silver bullets to this. If you want to have an electric vehicle-based transportation system, you have to have a fossil fuel grid, you have to have charging infrastructure, you have to have the financial infrastructure to make it work. Otherwise, if you don't have this ecosystem, this kind of policy system is vulnerable to the kind of pushback that we've seen in Ontario. Second, you have to grow political and economic coalitions. You cannot solve climate change without getting political. I'm biased, I'm a political scientist, but I'm convinced of that for multiple reasons. And so growing political and economic coalitions must be a key focus. We have to grow new political and economic interests to face the entrenched interests that want to see the status quo continue. So there's good things along these lines, like nationally, having a rebate along the carbon tax is a way to grow support for climate action, potentially. But even at the individual level, it's not just about taking individual action, it's making individual action social and visible. I put up a thing of bullfrog here because this is what's in my front yard right now. It makes very little difference to the world if I pay Bullfrog Bullfrog's a company that offsets electricity usage. Essentially, they figure out how much electricity you use and they put that much green electricity or fossil fuel-free electricity into the grid. It makes zero difference to the world, to climate, that my house is basically fossil fuel-free energy. But having a sign like this out makes it just a little bit of difference because it starts to make my individual choice social, makes it visible. It makes it part of the larger societal discussion about the place of renewable energy in our societies. That's also why, even though we have an ESSO station that just went up into our neighborhood, we also have a net zero committee in our neighborhood association. Building the social capital, building the kind of political and economic associations that can push back and start to challenge the status quo is going to be a very important way of getting unstuck. And finally, and Amanda's going to talk a lot more about this than I am, we have to focus on equity and justice moving forward. This is Babies for Climate Justice is my single favorite climate change slogan. It's really the only way forward ethically and morally. The idea that as societies move towards low carbon, that they are going to have to deal with the inequities and injustices in our current society and prevent new injustices and inequities from emerging as we transition to a low carbon society. That's the only way forward ethically or morally. And as a political scientist, I'm also convinced that it's the only way, that efficacious way, or the only effective way to move forward politically. And so to me, those three things, thinking about system change, thinking about building economic and political coalitions, and focus on equity and justice is the sort of key ingredients in the recipe for getting unstuck. Thank you so much.
So you talked about how you had like a net zero commission on your neighborhood level. Could you maybe talk a bit more about how like, you tether that to larger committees going up to like provincial and national level, and maybe just what your net zero neighbor community does in the first place?
Yeah, and so our net zero committee for our neighborhood does things like try and get people in the neighborhood up to speed on what's possible to do with their houses and transportation choices. And so we've run webinars on heat pumps, we've run webinars on induction stoves, we've run webinars on e-bikes, electronic bikes, and things along these lines. And so our whole goal is to essentially have our neighborhood be fully informed about the kind of choices that are available and the kind of policies and incentives that are available for governments to make their homes and transportation choices as carbon-free as possible. But just like I said with my use of Bullfrog, one neighborhood in Toronto is not is a drop in the bucket for global climate change. And so we also think about this in context, or I do as a political scientist, think about this in the broader context. And so part of our neighborhood association and our neighborhood's activities are tied to Transform TO, which is the citywide approach to trying to get Toronto to act on climate change. And one of the things that we do in conjunction with Transform.to is we try and talk with other neighborhood associations to try and get this sort of scaled up and moving throughout the city. And then in terms of broader implications, the long-range hope is that as Toronto, as a city, and as the main economic driver of both the province of Ontario and really Canada, as Toronto starts to transform, this is going to open up all kinds of opportunities, political opportunities and economic opportunities to start seeing broader change. And so it's really about thinking about these multiple levels, doing what you can within the constraints that one has, but always keeping an eye on the way that even small actions are connected to some of those larger forces of inertia that I was talking about.
Let's thank Professor Hoffmann again for his presentation. And really detailed answer. Really great. And now I'm going to go on to our second speaker, Jasmine Burke. She is a member of the hydrometallurgy group at Hatch, an engineering and management consultancy firm. Her work in hydrometallurgy involves the use of aqueous or water-based chemistry to recover metals from ores and recycled materials. Her work includes recycling of lithium-ion batteries to recover metals and generate battery-grade materials for manufacturing. She received her Bachelor of Science in Engineering from Queen's University, specializing in chemical and process engineering. Then she received her Master's of Applied Science in Chemical and Environmental Engineering from the Royal Military College of Canada. So now I'm going to pass it off to Devin to tell us about From Waste to Electrification, Powering the Electric Evolution.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for attending today. So I'm going to talk a bit about electrification and where that fits in with climate change. Okay, so the increasing impacts of climate change are something that is affecting us both individually and societally, and we need to do more in order to curb the effects of climate change. So greenhouse gas emissions and carbon dioxide emissions in the atmosphere are what are causing our overall global warming. And in order to combat that, different organizations, governmental bodies are targeting climate change initiatives and proposed regulations for zero emissions in new vehicles, for example. So what zero emissions means is things like electric vehicles, which don't burn gas or fossil fuels, and therefore they have decreased emissions in that sense. So the Canadian regulations that have been proposed by our governments are for a target of 100% of new vehicles being zero emissions by the year 2035. What that means is significant requirements for increasing manufacturing of batteries, electric vehicles, as well as other components of the electrical grid for energy storage, things like that. So how do electric vehicles and internal combustion engines compare? So here we're looking at an electric vehicle and an internal combustion engine, which is referred to as ICE here. If we're looking at these on the average lifespan of a vehicle, which is about 150,000 kilometers, we can look at how the individual components of the energy requirements for these vehicles create CO2 emissions. So on the side of the graph, you'll see CO2 emissions, which is in grams per kilometer. You can see that the manufacturing of the car contributes about the same amount of energy requirements and CO2 emissions for either an electric vehicle or internal combustion engine. If we compare, however, the production of the fuel for these types of vehicles, the internal combustion engine actually has a lesser requirement for fuel production. And electric vehicles have a significant requirement for fuel production, and that's resulted from the energy which we use to produce the electricity. So if we shift our electrical production requirements more towards sustainable energy production, such as hydro, solar, wind, and nuclear energy sources, we can even decrease these kind of fuel production requirements in terms of CO2 emissions even further than what they are at present. So essentially, we can also look at what that net zero means for the vehicles. So electric vehicles have no tailpipe emissions, no exhaust. And that means that the CO2 emissions that we get from an internal combustion engine are zero in that sense. And the only additional CO2 emissions that are coming from electric vehicles themselves is going to be from the manufacturing of the batteries. So the batteries that we manufacture for electric vehicles have a high requirement for electricity, and that's where that CO2 emissions are coming from. And as we said earlier, if we can decrease our energy consumption from more fossil fuel-based energies to more sustainable energy production, we can even decrease these CO2 emissions even further. If we compare also the electric vehicle and the internal combustion engine based on how much CO2 emissions they make, essentially after 28,000 kilometers of driving, your internal combustion engine and your electric vehicle will be equal in terms of CO2 emissions. So that means after 2 years of driving your vehicle, your electric vehicle will have significantly less CO2 emissions. And that's the case for US and Europe alike. So where do we get the materials for these electric vehicle batteries? Well, typically they're from mining. So we mine an ore and then proceed with several different processes in order to produce the batteries from cathode materials. Alternatively, however, we can use some different types of processes to recycle these. Basically, the mining of these elements is also only possible for certain geographical regions. For example, cobalt is one of those elements that can only be mined almost exclusively in the Congo. Lithium is also another element that we use a lot in these lithium-ion batteries, and it can be gathered from more geographical regions, but a little bit more scarce. So overall, these metals from ores are limited resources, and they're from non-renewable. So it's important for us to find ways to use them more sustainably. And that's where our recycling comes in. So we can recycle spent or used batteries to produce new batteries through several different kinds of processes. Those being things like pyrometallurgy, hydrometallurgy, and direct recycling. So pyrometallurgy is one of the most common methods used, and what that means is smelting or burning of the batteries, which generates some CO2 emissions there as well. And it's only able to recover certain elements from the batteries, like cobalt and nickel, in the form of an alloy. So an alloy is a mixture of metals. In this case, it's going to be primarily cobalt and nickel. But also during this process, we can't recover the lithium. And as we all know, the main thing in a lithium-ion battery, or the main thing that makes it work, is lithium. So we can use processes like hydrometallurgy, which allow us to recover this lithium. So hydrometallurgy is the use of aqueous chemistry to recover metals from ores, recycled, or residual materials. So in my role at Hatch, I help to design chemical processes which are used for things like battery recycling and production of battery materials. So how do we recover these battery materials? So lithium-ion battery recycling, you can see here a picture of a battery. This is a pouch cell type battery, which is something that would be in like your phone or computers, some kind of consumer electronics. So we can take and disassemble those batteries using mechanical separation processes and take out several materials from these. So one of them is called black mass, and what it is, it contains battery metals such as cobalt, nickel, and lithium, as well as graphite. Another component of it is the foils, which is the copper and aluminum casings of the batteries primarily, and then plastics, which are the coating of the batteries. So the main one that we focus on is the black mass material, because it contains the battery cathode material and is more valuable in terms of the limited resources we have available for those. So we take those black mass materials and we can do what's called bleaching. What this means is that we add the materials to an aqueous or water-based solution with several chemical reagents and also often adding heat for these reactions. We can then separate them using a series of chemical or physical separation processes, such as a precipitation reaction, which is shown here. And we can individually capture the different metal components of the battery cathode material. So after we've done that, you can see we're at the middle portion of the hydrometallurgical process, or the precipitation, and then we can resynthesize new cathode material using the materials that we've recycled. We can then make new batteries with these. So where does that fit in with climate change and how we're going to impact our net reduction in CO2 emissions? So battery recycling is going to help us make a more circular economy for these types of materials. What that means is that by reducing our extraction needs or reducing our need for mining by recycling, we can reduce the CO2 emissions that are going to be resulted from the mining of these new materials, and instead recycle them back into the process for manufacturing and allow continued use of these non-renewable resources. So, to summarize, electrification is going to require significant quantities of battery materials. And recycling of these batteries is going to continue to help make use of non-renewable resources and reduce our carbon emissions overall. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin, for your talk. Oh, okay. Sorry, something happened to my setup here. That's fine. We have a few minutes for questions. If you raise your hand, Isha will bring the mic to you.
So in terms of costs, how different is it, like in comparison between like recycling and extracting the materials right from like excavation?
Yes, I think you're asking how costly it is in terms of
Yeah,
the
cost
comparison.
effective. Yeah.
I think it's actually substantially more cost effective opposed to the mining operations. If you have an already established like mining operation, then I guess it's probably comparable, but in terms of the actual cost, you're taking the material when it's already been kind of processed, so it makes it easier to recycle it and put it into that production process as opposed to taking like a new ore material. It requires a lot of pre-processing essentially.
Okay, and then we'll take one more question.
Yes. So I assume all of this is hypothetical so far. So, like in terms of actual time, how long do you estimate before we actually have like a full-fledged battery recycling infrastructure and industry?
Yes, so a lot of companies are starting to work on this. Several clients that I work with in my current role are already in operation to start kind of building facilities for this type of recycling operations. One of the things that is kind of going to stall the process of setting up this whole infrastructural system is that the actual EV batteries and more batteries that are going to be
Hello. Okay, great. It's nice to see you all here on this slightly rainy day. Yeah, so a little bit of what I'm going to cover today. I'll just introduce myself a bit and how I come to the work I do in my PhD research. And then I'm going to walk you through a few concepts that I'm working through with activists in Toronto, everythingness, climate justice, and thinking through different points of convergence. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call deep organizing and some of the challenges that emerge trying to do that. So I'm an activist first and a researcher second. I came to the question of climate change because I grew up hearing about it. I was, already of a generation where, at least in the spaces I was in, climate denialism wasn't really as much a part of the conversation. I watched the Al Gore documentary when I was in primary school, and I was hearing all these warnings. And so when I came to university, I decided to get involved with my local divestment movement on campus. I'm actually an alum from U of T here. And so at that time, I was working with an NGO called 350.org. Does anyone know how many parts per million carbon dioxide we're at right now today? Or does anyone know? Yeah.
We just broached 420 today, actually.
We just broached 420, so we're not actually going in the right direction. But yeah, 350 is a group that was founded to try to raise awareness around, like parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and needing to get off fossil fuels. So this is a news clip from a couple days ago. Scientists deliver final warning on the climate crisis, act now or it's too late. And in some ways I feel like I've been hearing this message my entire life, act now or it's too late. And as an activist I feel like that's something I've been saying my entire life too, is climate justice now. And so that kind of leads me to this question of like how do we, in a way similar to Matt, of how do we get unstuck, but as an activist there are different reasons for why we also get stuck. So Guterres, the UN Secretary General, when the UN report came out, the latest IPCC report, he issued this call. He seems also quite nervous like the rest of us. He said, our world needs climate action on all fronts, everything, everywhere, all at once. Did anyone see the movie by that name? Yeah, so that's kind of what climate action feels like as an activist, is that you need to be doing everything, everywhere, all at once. But how do you even know where to start when everything seems so big and so overwhelming? So that's kind of what I call the everythingness problem. So the activists I work with take systemic collective action as something taken for granted. They're not really typically thinking about changing the light bulb as the end of climate action. They're thinking about synergistic interactions with systems of power, so things like capitalism and colonialism feeding the climate crisis. And then also thinking about how climate change amplifies already pre-existing inequalities. So when we think about both impacts and solutions, there are equity considerations. But that can be really overwhelming when we see the top of the pyramid here, is that there's this kind of desire we have to tackle everything all at once at the same time, everything everywhere all at once. And that also requires everyone to building these kinds of broad-reaching coalitions. And that's a little bit about, that's kind of what climate justice as a framework tries to open up as a frame of thinking. So we have inequalities at different scales. So here, this is a picture of the recent flooding in Pakistan, right? Which is a country that has not contributed a lot to the climate crisis, but is bearing the brunt of the impacts. But then when you look at things like solutions here in Toronto, we're trying to get anyone heard of the Rapid TO project through transformative? Efforts to try to get one priority bus lane on Jane Avenue or Jane Street are extremely difficult, and part of that is because, part of the equity considerations that come up there are who lives in those neighborhoods, who has access to reliable transit. So both on impacts and in solutions, there are equity considerations to take into account. So I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about an attempt that was made by some activists I work with to try to get different people in different sectors of Toronto to think about climate justice at a local scale, not thinking so much globally, but in here in Toronto, what could it mean to take action on climate change? So last November, we brought together like 35 different groups from across the city, about 100 people came out, and even though none of us are astronomers, we actually were already thinking like astronomers even before I was invited to this talk. So this is kind of a visualization of a climate just Toronto, and some of the planets here kind of represent like big pictures of areas where we would need to take action. So indigenous sovereignty, building local power, food, labor, housing, transit, policing. And some of these connections can seem really obvious, like transit and climate change makes sense, right? Low carbon, but some of the connections can seem kind of like transient and distant, like what does policing have to do with climate change? But we spent a whole day thinking about this. We had a morning session thinking about positive visions for change, and then an afternoon session where we tried to get a little bit into tactics and organizing. And I'm going to walk you through super briefly just some of the ideas that came out from 3 of them. So the housing group was thinking about how housing also intersects with transit and with policing as well. So like where sustainable housing is built and how people can get to and from work and community. And these are some of the groups that were present at this breakout group here. So we had like Kensington Land Trust, York South-Weston Tenant Union. We were also thinking about how a lot of times when we think about sustainable housing, it's for homeowners, but it's more difficult for renters to be taking action on climate change. I'm going to skip through this one, I think. Oh, also thinking a little bit about minimum, maximum temperatures on the impact side. The transit group was thinking about mostly bus lanes, so I was telling you a little bit about the Jane bus lane. That's something that folks were really excited about thinking through, is how do we actually get priority bus lanes, like a red kind of painted bus lane so you can get faster access separate from cars. And so TDC Riders, which is a local advocacy group, is there, and Climate Justice Toronto, they were thinking through how we could try to get these bus lanes. And then food was another intersection where we were thinking, and this kind of is where you can see the connection to global too, right? Because how our food gets here to Toronto, it's connected to global systems, and there are, of course, emissions impacts in how our food comes to Toronto, but then there are also local equity impacts in who has access to healthy and low carbon food in the city of Toronto. But spoiler alert, we didn't actually achieve the climate justice city in one day. There were a lot of challenges, even working with people who are all for collective action, all for systemic changes, all for putting their heart and soul into it. And some of those challenges have to do with really just human considerations like trust and skepticism. So one of the things we found was that it was really easy to get climate activists out to this event, and quite challenging to get anybody else out to this event. So all the people who wanted to talk to about housing, about transit, about food, who weren't already thinking of themselves as a climate activist, didn't immediately jump at the opportunity to come to this event. And we actually had to turn away a lot of the climate activists who were like asking us and emailing us saying like, can I get another ticket? There was a black market to come to this event, literally. There are competing demands too. The same day this event happened, there was the Bill 23. I don't know how many of you were following, but the actions that Ford has been taking around housing. So a lot of the housing groups couldn't come this day. They just had other stuff to do and other priorities. There was another group that we really wanted to come that does really important work with Latin American immigrants in the community. And they were out dancing the night before at a bar, and so they just didn't people into the room too. And getting projects off the ground is even harder. So one thing that I found kind of interesting was there were really cool ideas that came out of the food group, but none of those projects really took off. And yet, even though the housing breakout completely fell apart on the day of, one of the groups I'm working with is pursuing trying to create a sustainable housing campaign. And that's just because that's what people were interested in. We're in the middle of a housing crisis in Toronto, so housing is a pressing issue. And so there's a drive to work on that, even if things didn't come together on the day. Where is their willingness to work together? So a lot of the collaborations that took off was because people already knew each other before the event. There was cross-pollination. There were people from TPC riders who were also part of a climate group. Or there were people who were friends with each other and they trusted each other and had that willingness to work together. So that kind of leads me to deep organizing. So I think that part of what we need to be moving towards is relationship building in a local, specific, geographical context, rooting ourselves in like existing structures in society, like your neighborhood association, as Matt was talking about, schools, your workplace, and leveraging those connections towards a particular campaign goal. But the problem with relationship building is that it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of turnover in activism. So people come and go, and sometimes they don't stick around long enough to see that through. So there's a tension there as well. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, we have a couple minutes for questions before we head to our panel. Please raise your hand. Isha will come with a mic for you. Back there.
Hello. I just had a question to ask. What I've seen in recent climate justice moves is that there's a major divide between actions that focus on climate mitigation strategies and actions that focus on climate change and climate adaptations. And I see there's a big divisive in terms of people's opinion. And I find that, I feel that's like a problem. I was wondering if that's been addressed when you attend these events, because of that, then people's priorities then differ in terms of how we approach the situation.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think both are really important, especially now that the climate crisis is upon us. I think the adaptation side is probably more important than it was 10 or so years ago. Yeah, like some of the ideas that came out of the housing group were more on adaptation, were around like minimum and maximum temperatures in buildings. So trying to ensure that like renters can have access to air conditioning, which there's a tension there too though, right? Because air conditioning contributes to the climate crisis, but we know that homeowners living in Rosedale have access to that too. So there's sometimes, for climate justice activists, sometimes the equity part is maybe even more important. But then yeah, like transit is more on the like mitigation side. So I mean, I think both are still necessary, but yeah, I guess I see that as well.
Great. Okay. Thank you all very much for your talks. And we will now go to the panel. Great. Seems the lights come on. Perfect. Great. Okay. So you all have now met our lovely panelists, heard a bit about them, and we will have our panel moderator, who is Isha Dasgupta. She's also a PhD student in the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics. And I will hand it off.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It was a really bad weather this morning. Switched, but it's still windy. But yeah, so we start off our panel discussion, and essentially, if anyone has a question, they should raise their hand, ask it out loud. I'll repeat the question for you, for our panelists. And I also have a couple questions of my own, but I do want to ask everyone, in case there's any elsewhere. Okay, if you can just. Oh.
Okay, so in terms of controlling climate change, there's I noticed a little bit of a lack of emphasis on solutions that are kind of like unpopular, kind of like trigger people or the feelings. Things like, for example, like diet, like eating more plant-based and less animal products, because of course meat is one of the biggest sources of carbon, and things like population control. Like there's no way we can control climate change with 8 billion people, even with green energy, there's still going to be a huge impact. So measures that are long-term, like discouraging large families and letting the human population maybe wind down a little bit from 8 billion, we go down to like half of what is now. All these options for long-term sustainability, but I don't see too much emphasis on it in terms of like climate change discussions or even sustainability in general, environmentalism in general. So I'm kind of curious about your opinions about this. Thanks.
Sorry, could you repeat the specific question once again, so we can get that? Just the last part.
Like discussing like more unpopular methods of sustainability, like say abolishing animal agriculture and getting people to eat mostly, if not completely, plant-based, and say population control, like winding down the human population, letting people age and die off naturally, and let the population go down instead of 8 billion, maybe make it like 3 billion or 4 billion or whatever. Keeping in mind the population was only about 1 billion until like, what was it, the 20th century or 19th century, I think.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you can start.
So, a couple of things. One is that things that are potentially unpopular climate actions are only unpopular from the perspective of the status quo. And sometimes we think too much about, or we forget, how bad the status quo is for so many people. And so sometimes I wonder why it is, what it is we're trying so hard to preserve when we say we can't have these kind of changes, we can't move this fast, we can't do these things. Because the status quo, the fossil, extractive, consumerist society that we have right now is really bad for lots of people. And let me turn that to the population question. It's not that we have too many, climate change doesn't come from the fact that we have too many people. Climate change comes from the distribution of resources and the distribution of emissions. The top 1% in the world produces half the emissions coming out of the world. Quoting an Oxfam report here, and I hope I'm getting the numbers right, but it is not the 8 billion people, it is, in fact, the emissions of the wealthy. And when we can talk about that in terms of individuals or wealthy countries vis-a-vis less wealthy countries. And so, yes, they're going to be unpopular, but unpopular for whom?
Yeah, I agree with everything Matt just said. I would also just add to thinking, like, in the implementation side too, this is where like the justice and equity parts come in, of like who is like vegan or vegetarian food accessible to. Oftentimes it's like more expensive, and so it can be kind of like it can be perceived sometimes as like a accessible to more people and also culturally appropriate too, right? Like a lot of indigenous groups, there are like indigenous communities that hunt meat, for instance, and it's like part of their culture, and they're doing it in a sustainable way that's like in harmony with the local environment. Like, I think that needs to be taken into consideration differently from someone who's getting their meat from a factory farm. And then we can think too of like the working conditions of people who work in factory farms. It's not pleasant work. It's often racialized, low-income people who work in those factories. And so we can think too, like, what are the possibilities for coalitions around, like, environmentalists working with factory farm workers? Like, is there a way to think of a climate, I'm just saying this off the top of my head, I don't know when I'm working on this, but like, is that a connection that could be forged to make veganism or vegetarianism or whatever something that doesn't appear as only this kind of like elite choice, and make those intersections and systemic considerations more prevalent? Because they exist everywhere, but it's about pulling them out, and that's where I think the role of activism comes in. Because if everything's connected, it can also sometimes fall into like nothing. Like there's this everythingness and nothingness, so you have to choose what you're gonna dig into.
Thank you so much. Are there any follow-up questions? Or... Yeah.
I have a question about inertia that you talked about, and just generally talk about like the government inaction. So much of this power actually is held with governments all over the world, and like how do we kind of change that? And like I think in North America and Europe, there's an aging population. There's a little bit of a shift to the right that's going on. Like how do we kind of address these issues? Like I don't really understand them. Of course, like everything is like sitting with these specific like 1%, 2%, or like politicians. Like how do we kind of shift that balance back to the people again? Like I don't understand it, of course. Like it happens with community organizing, of course. But like how do we kind of like really question these really powerful people?
Yeah. So I can paraphrase the question. How do we essentially shift the like hold our power, whoever is in power, accountable, essentially? I would be really curious.
I feel like if I had the answer to that question, that would be like my work would be done. Yeah, I mean, I think it's about partly it's like framing and like picking a villain. I think having a villain is useful. Like that's, I mean, the very first campaign I worked on was fossil fuel divestment, and part of why I found it appealing, even though that's no longer what I'm working in now, was that it created a story that I could put myself into. So fossil fuel industry, public enemy number one, which maybe now I don't know if that seems obvious to people. It did at the time when I was joining that movement. It was very much like climate change, bad, but like we don't know who to blame. So placing the blame, and then situating, in that case, it was situating students as like having agency, as actors that could take the institution of the university and push it to divest from fossil fuels. And the university has now divested, by the way, its endowment fund, not the pension, but the endowment. So, but yeah, so now we're pretty good. There's also the implementation side. But yeah, I think partly it's about creating a story, because otherwise it's so overwhelming. Like there has to be a simple story with actors and villains and heroes that people can then see themselves participating in, and that's how you create like a movement around something, because otherwise you do just get stuck. It does just feel like nothing's ever going to change, so why even bother? But I don't know if there's more net.
A couple things. I agree with what Amanda's talking about here. So on the sort of the larger political front, I would say we need to move climate politics to be political but not partisan. And we get stuck in this And what I mean by political but not partisan, political in the sense that we need to make political choices about priorities for our society. That's politics. But especially in North America and in Australia, climate politics is not just about making priorities for our society and the tough choices that are necessary to do that. It's become part of the sort of left-right polarization. That's not true everywhere. Now in Europe, in many places in Europe, people fight hard about what to do about climate change and what solutions to pursue and which things to take on. But they don't have the same sort of political polarization over whether to take action. And so I think that, especially in Canada, we need to be working harder. Those that are interested in climate action need to be working harder to make it less about political polarization. And partly this means that anyone that is interested in climate action needs, that's why whenever someone asks me, what's the number one thing that people can do? Well, first of all, first is vote, and second is tell politicians why you're voting. Because we will see governmental action start to move when the political parties think that they can win elections or will lose elections on the basis of what kind of climate action they decide to take. The second thing I would say, and I alluded to this a little bit in the talk, is about building coalitions. The reason why we find governments as an obstacle to climate action is because right now they perceive the national interest to be aligned with the status quo and with entrenched interests that are part of the interests that are causing climate change. And so the more that we see people moving towards heat pumps, towards electric vehicles, towards renewable energy, this starts to build economic interests that want to see action on climate change. And the more that kind of political counterbalance can be developed, and this is why some of the divestment movement is so important in terms of getting large-scale capital to move in different directions. That is a start to counterbalance some of these interests that government is listening to.
Any more? Oh, yeah.
Hello. As an employee for the region of Peel, we strive to work towards climate action and try to minimize our greenhouse gases and all. And just based on hearing all three of your feedback, and working in one of the recycling centers as a program contract specialist, an example of the program we did was that we worked with DOT's bicycle recycling program. We worked with bike chain at with University of Toronto, try to divert bikes, put it back in the community, reduce their greenhouse gases. So based on your expertise, with the collaboration with the climate justice, I was wondering what kind of, do you happen to have any ideas of certain local solutions that could be pertaining waste that could be implemented at the community level?
Yeah, so essentially implementing measures at the community level. Some of your talk did address that. So I'm going to start with Amanda again.
Yeah, I think, I think municipal climate action is increasingly what I'm drawn to because it's new to me though. I previously did a lot more kind of international federally focused work, but it's the level that has the most direct impact on your life, right? So, and I think that's where there's the possibility to bring in people who aren't already thinking about climate change. You can get them on they're thinking on transit because it's just a basic need of getting to work or getting to wherever you have to go. That's okay. It doesn't matter if climate change isn't their top issue. If there's a point of intersection there, bike lanes too. Bike lanes just make the city nicer and more enjoyable to live in. So you can find part of what I'm thinking about too with climate justice is just what would it mean to have a more livable city too? Can we actually just make City of Toronto while we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, yeah, like I think as much as possible, it's like bringing my thinking now is moving towards is that we need to be bringing the climate conversation into every other sector, because we already have kind of a lot of people, at least from my experience as an activist, who will come out to a climate strike or something. You know, we saw that massive flux of people, especially in 2019. There are these peaks and valleys in movements, but like I think what the climate strike showed us is there are enough people who like have that latent interest in it, but we're not reaching people who aren't already self-identified or self-selecting climate activists. So that's where I'm thinking now.
Yeah, so obviously with the increasing kind of push towards us bringing in EVs and things like that, it's not going to be something that's accessible for everyone, but I think on the municipal basis, what's going to be important is us kind of pushing where we can make a difference. That, like you were saying, more local recycling programs, be that your household recycling, your or just see what you can do. There's different places like you can recycle household batteries and things like that. Those are materials we can all recycle from our homes that are common use. And so I think we'll see more of that. But I think as Professor was saying, there's municipally we can also make more of a difference in pushing the voting and pushing politicians and to continue to develop more infrastructure for more sustainable energy production and things like that. That's been something that we have to push for, but overall, I think there's going to be a big need for a lot of infrastructure change in order for us to make a real difference, I think, in climate change.
Just a quick follow-up to that. In terms of infrastructure change, what things do any of you think would be stuff that we should do in Toronto to be able to make it easier to use these types of alternatives and be more environmentally friendly?
I guess one thing that Amanda was talking about is a lot of it centering around making transit more accessible. There's a lot of us who drive, but a lot of us who transit as well, and finding ways that we can make it more accessible and easier for people to take transit, and safer for people to take transit, so that we can make use of those systems and cut down on the individual emissions that we're all generating. And another facet of that is when we do start this transition to electric, making different electric vehicle stations more accessible. As you were saying, different policies have influenced our accessibility for those kind of things, and in order to support this transition, that there has to be a lot in place and a lot of ability to access these things that we don't currently have. So we have to start making those changes now in order to support that.
Any other questions from the audience?
So Matt, you were talking about how we need to depersonalize the climate change debate in politics. I was wondering if you think that, based on Amanda's comments about how people in younger generations are sort of starting to take this issue for granted, and then start from that point and start to debate what we actually need to do about it. Do you think that's encouraging? Do you think that issue is going to solve itself? Or do you think that, yeah, what's to be done there more broadly?
I think it's moving that way. I'm always hesitant to think issues will solve themselves, but I think it is definitely moving that way. Just on the Canadian national political spectrum right now, it was actually quite encouraging in the last federal election that it was really the first federal election that all parties, all major parties had a real climate platform. Now, there were varying qualities, but there was a real climate platform. It'll be interesting to see with the next federal election if that's the same. But at least in the 2021 election, the last federal election, parties felt like they would be punished if they didn't have a climate platform. And so I think that that is kind of an evolution that hopefully will continue. And I think you're right that this is generational change. It's not just generational change, though. I think it's going to be influenced by a couple of other things. I think as we see more climate impacts, and we are going to see more climate impacts, we're going to see more summers like we had in BC with massive heat domes and forest fires. We're going to see the DVP flooded more and more. We're going to see massive hurricanes on the East Coast. As we start to see these climate impacts, and if people make the connection to climate change, this is going to start to have that evolutionary effect on what people think is the baseline of what's necessary out of their politics. I also think that there's something we can do proactively, and this is along the climate justice aspects that Amanda was talking about, is if people can see living the good life through the transition that we're going to be going through, and at the other end of the transition, this builds political support across. Who doesn't want to live in a more livable city? Who doesn't want to live in a way that they can be pretty sure that their children and grandchildren are still going to have the kind of quality of life that they want? And so focusing on the way that climate action can address some of the things that aren't awesome about our current society and getting people to make those connections is a way to hopefully depolarize some of that.
One other thing I'll add too is that I don't want to give the impression, that it's solved. That I'll be like, I agree with what you said, because I think there's, even though a lot of young people, have that kind of baseline understanding of climate change or like on board with it, on board with climate action, voter turnout amongst young people is still really, really low. So there's actually, even though we might have some generational shifts, which are still to be seen if it's actually the direction we're going in, the implementation side, the getting people out, is still not, I don't think, should be taken for granted. There's a lot of apathy, there's a lot of anxiety, like climate grief, climate anxiety, and just kind of disappointment and distrust too with politicians, and that can lead to another form of getting stuck of like, well, even if I vote for this person, they're not going to do anything, right? Because we saw the graph you put up, right? Like all of these UN meetings, and then they say they're going to do this, and then nothing happens. It can be demoralizing, and it can be really hard after that kind of demoralizing moment to then try again. So, don't just go tweet about it. Please also vote and do all the other things.
I think we will wrap up there, and but we have a little something for you. It's a token of appreciation. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you all for coming as well.
Thank you all very much for taking the time to come out tonight, tell us a bit about your work, and also have some interesting discussion on what's going on, how we can go forward with that. And I know I learned a lot, and I hope that everybody else was able to as well. Before we thank our panelists one last time, I'd like to ask for your patience for a few minutes. I'm going to give some instructions and such on how to get to those top activities. So before I do that, I'd like to say thank you to all our volunteers. Welcome.